Hi everyone. I think I'm going to start, if that's okay. We have a full room today and a big busy program. Hopefully it's an exciting one for everybody who came all the way here. So welcome to the 26th annual Labelle Lectureship Series, honoring Roberta Labelle, an accomplished health services researcher, a teacher, and one of the founding members of the Center for Health Economics and Policy Analysis here at McMaster. The Labelle Lectureship Series in Health Services Research has been established by Roberta's colleagues, many of whom are in this room today, to provide an opportunity to renew ourselves in the spirit of resilient optimism that was hers, and to remind ourselves of her message that good research really can make a difference. Here at McMaster, we are surrounded by great minds. One of those great minds is Dr. Mike Veal. Dr. Veal is an MIT graduate and a professor of economics at Mac. He also serves as academic director for Statistics Canada's Research Data Centre. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mike Veal.
It's my pleasure to give the introduction. Can everyone hear me? So I remember Roberta not only as a talented researcher, but just as Firas just said, an enthusiastic researcher, really an enthusiastic person in everything. And she did, again, as was just said, had a deep commitment to research as a way of making people's lives better. That's one reason Dean Spears fits this lectureship so well. He's a remarkable young scholar with a BA from the University of his home state, Oklahoma, and a PhD from Princeton. In 2013, articles in many journals, including Social Science and Medicine, Demography, the Economic Journal, the American Economic Journal, Economics and Human Biology, Experimental Economics, the Journal of Health Economics, Economic Development and Cultural Change, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Much of his work is co-authored with Diane Coffey, including the book published by HarperCollins that is the basis of this lecture, and which won the 2017 Joseph Elder Prize for work in Indian social sciences, one of a number of academic awards he has won. But even more impressive than his scholarship is his commitment to improving people's lives. When he graduated in 2013, he did not follow the conventional job market path. Instead, with Dr. Coffey, he co-founded the Research Institute in Compassionate Economics. With funding from the National Institute of Health and recently $1.4 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it promotes solutions to problems in sanitation, social inequality, maternal health, and the environment. In India, he's also worked with the Delhi School of Economics, and now the Delhi School of Economics, excuse me. That's local. Around here, the place is called Delhi, but the Delhi School of Economics, and now the Indian Statistical Institute and the Swachh Bharat mission of the Government of India. As an empirical health researcher, Dean's work has echoes of a founding event of epidemiology, John Snow's study in 1854 of the Broad Street cholera epidemic in London, England. Just as England was transforming then, India is transforming now, with rapid economic growth that is not shared by all. Good health researchers and practitioners can't be squeamish. John Snow could not be squeamish in his studies that related to human sewage causing cholera. Dean Snow can't be squeamish either. No one can be squeamish in the fight against disease that is caused both by germs but also by social world. Let's welcome Dean Spears.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Thanks all for being here. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. It's an honor to be part of this lecture series, to get to share these thoughts in this book with you. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, to the questions afterwards. And my co-author, Diane, says hello to all of you. She's sorry she can't be here. Everything I say today is, joint work with not only Diane, but with the whole, RICE team, our organization, and Greater RICE, all of our collaborators. And so I just would be remiss not to start out by thanking all of them too. So Diane and I wrote a book. And, from all of our time traveling around India, from, little train stations where they'd have these book carts where you could, buy a mystery novel for 100 rupees. It turned out that mystery novels were my favorite type of book. I like mystery books. And so when we were going to write a book, we decided that we would write a mystery book. Now, it's not that sort of mystery book. There are no murders in it. but I think there are some very interesting and puzzling questions. And one of them starts with one of my favorite economic indicators, child height. So these are some children that we know in Sitapur district, where we've lived for several years in Uttar Pradesh. And children in India, as you know, you can't really tell in this picture because they're all standing next to one another, but children in India are unfortunately much too short relative to a healthy population. And that matters for a health economics lecture such as this one, because it turns out that on a population level, child height, the average height of children in a population, I think should be one of the most important indicators that people think about, right up there with GDP and poverty rates and things like that. So why is that? Why is height an important economic indicator? Well, it's because height tells us something important about what's going on in early life. So this picture is about child height in India. You can see pictures like this in a lot of developing countries. And so what's going on here? Well, the horizontal axis is age in months. So that's how old a kid is. So this is the average kids in India from age 0 to being about 5 years old. And the vertical axis is how tall they are relative to a healthy population. So the WHO has gone around the world and figured out how tall healthy children grow to on average. But what you can see here is that all of these numbers are negative. And that means that these kids are too short. Kids are shorter than they would be in a healthy population on average in India. That's true in a lot of developing countries, but in India it's true by a lot. This -2 number is really quite a lot of kids being too short. But the other thing that you can see in this picture is this very characteristic pattern, where it starts out a little bit bad, a little bit negative, because kids are already falling behind in utero when they're born, and then falls for the first 2 years of life, and then really flattens out. And so what that means is that when you see a kid at about 2 years old, you have an excellent predictor of how tall she's going to be as an adult. But it also means the reverse is true, that when you're looking at height for people who are adults, for people who are past the age of 2, you're learning a summary measure of what life was like for them when they were babies, when they were children. So looking at on average height in a population tells us something about babies, just like you can drill into the trees in a forest and see in the rings what was true of the forest a long time ago. So why does that matter? Because height's not the only thing going on in these first few years of life when you're a baby. Lots of other things are going on that are important and matter for you for your whole life. One of those is the development of your brain and your cognitive skills. So I have to be very careful here and talk about the extent to which all of this is true on average. So we all have a different genetic potential height that we can grow to, right? You, me, everyone in this room has a different genetic potential height that they could grow to. And the best evidence is that all around the world, those distributions of potential height are pretty much the same. So if you take a healthy Indian baby and raise her in a healthy environment in Sweden, she grows just as tall as Swedish children and vice versa, right? But we're not all raised in a healthy environment like that. And those of us that are raised in a healthy environment are more likely to grow to our height potentials. And those of us who are raised in a healthy environment are more likely to grow to our cognitive potentials also. And so that means on average in a population, a population where more children are growing to their height potentials is also a population where more children are growing to their cognitive potentials. A much too simplistic way to say all of that is that on average, at the population level, taller people have higher cognitive achievement. Now you have to say on average and at the population level and things like that. You can't compare person to person. Diane, who I wrote this book with, is a little bit shorter than I am. She's much smarter than I am. And so it's not at all something that you can compare across people with. But if you have a big enough data set, you see it. And I want you to see that here. This is a very famous line that I've reconstructed from a paper by Ann Case and Chris Paxson that was important in initially teaching economists about this and how it's important to the fact that taller people are paid more on average. There's a very famous line of taller kids in the U.S. being paid more. I want to go back in the back of the room so I can see it how you guys see. You see this very famous steep upward slope, right? Taller kids getting taller kids are better able to read, right? This is the same height for a T-score we saw before. No, you're shaking your head. You're saying this guy is crazy. I don't see it at all. And that's because I put it on the same axes as the same curve for Indian children. So taller Indian children are much more likely to be able to read, right? This is that height for a T-score that we saw a second ago where negative numbers are too short. And you see the Indian distribution is down here being too short. But what you see is a much steeper line for children in India than for children in the US. So India is a place where when you look at a kid's height, you're actually getting a very predictive signal of her cognitive achievement. The sorts of kids there who are having better early life health really are achieving more. And what that tells us is that these sort of early life health and net nutritional opportunities, this sort of early life embodied human capital, is a really important part of human capital and the sorts of things that are important in the Indian workforce. And so, if this is true, it's not really going to be any surprise that we see that human capital reflected in economic outcomes. And in fact, all around the world, whenever people look in data, whether it's in rich countries where people tend to have desk jobs or in poor countries where people tend to have more physical jobs, we see taller people being paid more on average. Here's an example from a paper by Tom Vogel in Mexico, where taller men in Mexico are paid more. You see it in Indonesia, you see it in India, you see it everywhere you look. On average, taller people are paid more because, especially in developing countries, the human capital that's embodied in you from your early life development is very important in a way that sticks around and lastingly stays with you what happened when you're a baby. So this is why I think that height should be one of these economic indicators that we talk about. Not person to person, but on average in a population. And if we know about the average height of a population, we know something important about human development. But it turns out there's a puzzle there. Because I've been telling you that height should be one of these key economic variables that we carry around with us, but it doesn't correlate very well with the other key economic variables that we carry around with us. So this is from a paper by Angus Deaton. In each one of these circles is a developing country. So these are from demographic and health survey data, and the bigger the circle, the bigger the country. So by population. So this is India. The black ones up there are sub-Saharan Africa. It's only countries that have a DHS, so China's not on here. This is the height. We've been looking at children, but this is adult women, so it's in centimeters. So you're learning about what was true 20, 30, 40 years ago. Those are the women measured in the DHS. You're seeing height in centimeters. So the average woman in India is about 150 centimeters tall at the time that the survey was done. And the horizontal axis here is GDP per capita. So these are richer countries. And what you can see in this picture is nothing whatsoever, right? Those don't really go together with one another at all, right? You can maybe put your thumb over one thing and another and try to convince yourself that there's some sort of correlation somewhere. But there's really not very much of one. What you can also see in this picture is that South Asia, and especially India here, is down here at the bottom, below sub-Saharan Africa. So the average woman in India is shorter than the average person in sub-Saharan Africa. And what's surprising about that is that that's still true today, even after several years of fast economic growth. So remember, this is about adult women, which means that it's about something slightly historical. What was true 20, 30, 40 years ago. But it's still true today, after several decades of fast economic growth in India, that kids in India are still more likely to be stunted than kids in sub-Saharan Africa. And so, like all sort of fascinating puzzles in research, this one has earned itself a name, the Asian Enigma, which is why are children in India shorter on average than children in sub-Saharan Africa who are poorer on average? And that's the sort of thing that's a real puzzle for a health economics researcher, because we're used to seeing socioeconomic status, income, class, wealth, and health point in the same direction, right? We're used to seeing richer societies be healthier societies and richer people within a society be healthier, right? But now we're starting to see something that we're going to see, several times today, which is that pointing in the other direction. Seeing richer people, a society where people are richer, having less health. So why are children in India shorter than children in sub-Saharan Africa who are poorer? Well, if we're going to be able to explain this, we're going to have some sort of input to early life health in India that's worse than in sub-Saharan Africa, even though people in India are richer. And that's what most of this talk is. And let me just say, it's not just about height. It's about other things too, such as neonatal mortality. India has higher neonatal mortality than other countries with higher poverty rates, right? So we see a pattern of that sort of thing being reversed. So let's talk about a candidate explanation, and it's one that I'm going to be talking about the whole rest of the time today, which is open defecation. What's open defecation? Well, it's a fancy word for what about 1 billion people worldwide do. They don't use a toilet or latrine. They go outside, they squat down, and they leave their feces on the ground, walk away, so that the germs in it can infect other people. Feces have germs in them. They have parasites in them. They have bacteria in them. And so when that sort of stuff is out on the ground, it's available, for other people to come into contact with, for flies to spread, to get in the water, to get in people's food, on their feet, on their fingers. Even a baby can be infected if, mom has it on her hands and she, puts her finger in the baby's mouth when it's crying or something that you see all the time. So, open defecation is something that makes people sick, that makes babies sick. And that sort of disease in early life, saps your nutrition, keeps you from putting your food to good use. And so what do we see about, is there worse open defecation in India than there is in other places such as sub-Saharan Africa? Well, this graph from UNICEF and the WHO suggests that there is. Each bar here is a region of the world, and what you see is on the left side of each bar is 1990, on the right side is 2010. So here's South Asia, here's sub-Saharan Africa. South Asia here is mainly India. There's hardly any open defecation in Bangladesh. There's very little in Nepal, or at least there's much less in Nepal. What we see is there's a lot of open defecation in India. It's helpfully color-coded brown there at the top of the graph. And you can see that there's more open defecation in South Asia, which you should basically be seeing as India, in 2010 than there was in sub-Saharan Africa in 1990. So we're more than 20 years behind sub-Saharan Africa. So it really does have some of these properties of a candidate explanation of being an input that's worse, even though people in India you'd think would be at least as able to afford toilets. And I won't have the opportunity to talk much more about this today, but it sure does look like it might be able to explain for some of these puzzles about height. So kind of like the graph I showed you from Angus Deaton, here we have height again on the vertical axis. So we're back to height of children. So negative numbers are too short. And it's children. It's from the demographic and health surveys. And each demographic and health survey, which means a country in a year, is a circle. So we've had 3 DHSs in India. So here's 1992, 1998, and 2005. The horizontal axis here isn't GDP anymore. It's open defecation density per square kilometer. So this is the average number of people who live near you who defecate in the open. So it's a combination of the fraction of people who defecate in the open and population density. Because if more people live near you, you're more likely to come into contact with their fecal germs. What we see is that kids in India have 2 bad things going for them, which is that a lot of their neighbors defecate in the open, and population density in India is very high. And so you see India down here, and you also see Bangladesh next to it, which is an interesting story. For one, Bangladesh has had many more DHS surveys than India has. We haven't had as much of a commitment to collecting data from the Indian government. But you see Bangladesh, which has even higher population density than India, but where open defecation has gone down by a lot, you see the circle going up, up, and away as kids there have gotten taller over time. India, on the other hand, has pretty much stayed in the same place. And you end up seeing this, really, tight graph with an R squared of greater than 60%. And, what this suggests is that the average height of kids in India is about what you would expect given the international trend in the association between sanitation and height, and given the enormous amount that they're exposed to. So we have a hint that it's not so puzzling at all. It's exactly what you would expect given this. Now, hopefully, you are all in your health economics classes and itching to raise your hand and say, well, that doesn't prove anything. That's just a scatter plot. And that's right. And so that's why we had to write a whole book to talk about this. And I hope that some of you will follow up on it and read it or ask about it in the questions. But at least what we can see from this picture is that there's not such a puzzle anymore. It's exactly what you would predict. And when you compare across districts, when you compare across villages, when you look at change over time, when you look at randomized experiments, over and over again, when you look at combinations of randomized experiments, you see that the magnitude of the effect of open defecation on child height turns out to be, when you take into consideration the fact that it's spread by your neighbors, just exactly enough to account for this average difference in Indian height. So maybe we've explained our initial mystery. I told you this was a mystery book, right? So maybe we've explained some of our initial mystery about why kids are so short. But we're left with, like, another puzzling mystery, right? If I said, kids in India come from richer households than kids in sub-Saharan Africa, but they're short because a lot of their neighbors defecate in the open, well, why is there so much more open defecation in India than there is not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but in neighboring Bangladesh and Nepal, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America? Why is open defecation in India so special? Well, one very often hears or reads sentences like this, especially in like policy documents made by the big international development organizations. This is from a famous policy book in India, actually by a friend of mine, it says, this is the sort of sentence you read all the time. In 2011, half of all Indian households did not have access to toilets. I bolded that, forcing them to resort to open defecation on a daily basis. In other words, the explanation that you hear all the time is that it's about access, it's about being forced, it's about being too poor. People had no choice, right? That's the sort of thing that one sees the Secretary General of the UN saying, that one sees leaders of the Indian government saying, that it's all about access. It's not about people having any sort of choice. People in India defecate in the open because they're so poor. Right? Well, we've already heard some trouble with that explanation, right? Which is that in other places we don't see that. So let's turn to the data and see what we find. Is it because of income? Is the reason that so many people in India defecate in the open because they don't have as much income? Well, so in this picture, we're going to find a lot of pictures where in all of them over and over again, the vertical axis is going to be the fraction of people who defecate in the open, taken from the UNICEF WHO Joint Monitoring Program data. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to consider in turn a few explanations for why this happens and put it on the horizontal axis. And so our first one is it's because they can't afford it. GDP per capita. Now, that doesn't make an enormous amount of sense because open defecation is what you do if you don't poop in a hole in the ground. And a hole in the ground is simply not that expensive, right? So what a lot of people are doing in places other than India is digging a simple pit, pooping in it, and possibly filling it up and moving on when that pit fills up. And so that doesn't cost very much money. It doesn't cost that much money to put some sticks and bricks and rocks in it to hold it up, maybe to put some tarp around it, right? Doing something other than defecating in the open doesn't have to cost very much. And I've seen people in Kenya and Bangladesh and Cambodia using very simple latrines made out of simple materials that couldn't cost more than $40, $50, $30, right? And they're using them, right? So if people in those places can afford it, people in India could afford to dig a hole like that too. And sure enough, what we see is that of the 55 countries that have lower GDP per capita than India, 46 of them have lower open defecation rates. And the ones that don't are really like, places where like something like, conflict is going on, like South Sudan, and they're really small places, like the size of an Indian district or something like that, one of India's 600 districts. Okay, maybe you think I'm not being fair, because we're talking about poor, but I did GDP. We all know that India and other developing countries are unequal places. Should I be using the poverty rate instead? But again, we see that insofar as there's a trend, India is way above it, right? There's much more open defecation in India than the trend would predict. And of 21 countries that have worse poverty rates than India, a higher fraction of people poor, 19 of them have a lower fraction of the population defecating in the open than India does. So I don't think, so it can't be that either. Here's one I hear all the time, especially from, people in the Indian state that are interested in the idea of using state resources to provide and build water. Is it about water? Do people in India defecate in the open more than people in other countries do because they don't have access to water? Well, there are two problems with that. The first problem with that explanation is that people in India have really great access to water compared to a lot of developing countries. And even where we lived in Uttar Pradesh, there were various hand pumps all along. And a hand pump isn't the same thing as having piped water. It's not great. You have to go to the hand pump, but they have them, right? So compared to other developing countries, access to water isn't all that bad. The other difficulty is that there's really not all that much of an association. And what you're telling me, Dean, what do you mean? That line is downward sloping. Places with more water have less open defecation. But notice that we've combined urban and rural in this graph. And I want to highlight that because, in the 2011 census in India, 89 or almost 90% of households that didn't have a toilet were in rural places. So open defecation in India is almost entirely a rural phenomenon, especially this idea that we're going to get into of not using the latrine that you have. And so when we're averaging over urban and rural places, urbanization could be an omitted variable, right? A thing that confounds our analysis, because urban places have more water and urban places have less open defecation. And sure enough, when we just look at rural places, we basically don't even see an association between access to water and open defecation. And India is way above the line. So it's not about water. People in India basically have it compared to other developing countries. Something I sometimes hear that it's about education. Maybe people in India defecate in the open because they don't. It's difficult to finish the sentence what people mean by it, but in 28 countries that have lower adult literacy than India, 23 of them have less open defecation, and again, it's sort of our tiny, conflicty outliers that don't. It's very common to find households where people have completed high school or even been to a little bit of college in places like Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or Rajasthan or Madhya Pradesh, and they still defecate in the open. One thing I sometimes hear is that maybe it's about governance. So this is a World Bank indicator of governance, nothing perfect, but it's something people use all the time. And the 47 countries that are worse of it, 39 of them have lower open defecation. But the trouble with this explanation is that in the other countries of the world, it's not the government that solved the problem. It's not that states have got people. States organize sewers, right? States take people from using latrines to using sewers. But in general, when people switch from defecating in the open to using a latrine, that's something that is done privately. They dig themselves a hole, they buy a latrine on the open market, they build it themselves or something. It's not something that governments have usually provided. Another way of thinking about it is that places like the DRC, Afghanistan, Haiti. I'm not thinking of the other examples off the top of my head. In India, I would say Pakistan. These are places that have lower open defecation than India, and probably not what we would think of as having better governance. And if you look within India, we see, sure enough, some of the highest open defecations in states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, the northern plain states that are not governance superstars. But if you look at Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, right? They're basically right behind UP and Bihar in terms of rural open defecation. They're typically taken as better governed states. The states that have very low open defecation rates are the ones in the northeast that are culturally dissimilar, but nobody's ideas of governance superstars. So the government explanation just doesn't line up either. I think it's important to emphasize this because, I'm going to talk as time goes on about the various state policies that have been done in India about open defecation, the sort of latrine construction policies that we've done over and over again. And it could be easy to misunderstand me as saying that it's the government's fault, right? I think governance, a line we have in the book is, the government hasn't been the solution to open defecation in India, but the government hasn't been the solution anywhere else either. And, it's probably not their fault. Okay. One last thing that we can learn from this international explanation, from this international statistics, is that I've been talking about India being unusual in the fact that it has so much open defecation. But that's not the only unusual thing about India. It's also unusual in what people do when they're not defecating in the open. So sanitation professionals sometimes talk about the sanitation ladder. You can defecate in the open, you can move up the ladder and have a simple pit latrine, or you could have like an improved, thing that flushes, has a nice big septic tank, or connects to a sewer. Right? So, and finally, at the top of the ladder, you get whatever's out in the hallway over there, right? The top of the sanitation ladder. So in all of these countries, and so you can look at the countries around the developing world, and you can split up sort of what fraction of people defecate in the open, what fraction of people use simple pit latrines, and what fraction of people do something better. So India is strange in that it has such a large fraction of the people defecating in the open. But India is also strange in that it has such a small fraction of the people using this middle option of plain old pit latrines, right? Of the sort that, we know from studies, from WHO recommendations, from experiments, make people better off. So this dark line here is open defecation. And you can see that India is more than all of these countries in open defecation. But the light line is unimproved latrines, just simple pit latrines. And so what you can see is that not only is the dark line bigger than all these other places in India, the light line is smaller. So people in India who don't defecate in the open, they're not going to these simple pit latrines. They're switching all the way to some sort of nice septic tank or something very expensive, one of these more improved toilets. So we have a puzzle. We have this clue. And we've set aside a lot of pieces that don't fit. Right? It's not about income. It's not about education. It's not about governance. Right? So what is it that might explain our puzzle? Well, what we figured out we were going to have to do next is simply ask people. So we called in the SQUAT team. The SQUAT survey was our survey that went to 5 states in northern India, UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Haryana. So the Hindi-speaking plain states. And so you can see our SQUAT team here. Big shout out to Ashish and Nidhi for leading it. That went around and asked people what they do. Because up till this point, we basically had 2 types of data sources. You have the census, which happens every 10 years, and is pretty much a record of what households own. So we know, does your household have a toilet, and if so, what sort? Or you have something like the DHS, the Demographic and Health Surveys, which asks a mixed-matched household-level question about what you use. Like, what do people in this household in general typically do? But either way, you're only getting one answer, right? And so what that means is there's no way for somebody to say to you, I have a toilet, but I don't use it. Or I have a toilet, and he uses it, but she doesn't. And so that's why we had to do our own survey. So we, drug survey forms and pots and pans and clipboards all around North India in the fall and winter of 2013-14 in the spring, and basically asked this question over and over again. Asked, indelicate questions about where people poop. And an interesting fact that a lot of people are surprised by is that people were perfectly happy to tell us and talk about this. That there's a presumption, amongst Western audiences or amongst elite urban audiences in Delhi, that this is going to be some sort of secret. But if everybody you know defecates in the open, if you live in a place where essentially no one you have a personal relationship with does anything else, then it's not going to be so embarrassing to say that you defecate in the open. Another thing that we did is to make clear that we really cared about the answer they gave. So we would say, and we'll get back to this later on if we talk about the data that's currently being collected by the government of India. We would say, I've been to some villages, and some people defecate in the open, and some people use latrines. Now tell me, brother, what do people in this household do? I'm going to ask you about each person. Yesterday, did Diane defecate in the open, or did she use a latrine? Yesterday, did Dean defecate in the open, or did Dean use a latrine? And by asking about each person, we were open to the idea that it might be different. And sure enough, it is. Oh, sorry, I skipped the human interest part of life in Sitapur as we were piloting the survey. So here's Nikhil, who really made this happen, and Sivita. Here we are training everybody. There's Nidhi, there's Diane, there's Nikhil again, and some of our squat surveyors. This is in Sitapur district. And it was baby goat season, so I could not show a picture of that. All right, so what did we find? We were open to the possibility that maybe some people have a latrine and don't use it. And so only looking at households that have a latrine, which is absolutely the minority in these rural plains villages, we find that a lot of them are just what you would expect. They have a latrine and nobody's using it. This is probably a case where the government has come along at some point, built them a latrine that they never wanted in the first place. So it's not like they went out and made it. It's the government has built them one, and no one's used. Probably it has like a dung cake stored in it, a pool stored in it, or someone's using it to bathe in, or someone's using it to wash clothes in, or maybe they're stacking their animal feed in it, or something like that. You see it where people build these little lips on the bottom of it so the goat can put its head over and eat. So that's most of them. You will also see an important chunk where nobody defecates in the open and everyone's using a latrine. And there's this very interesting case here that the DHS, the census, just ruled out in advance, and that to most people it just seems unfathomable. People who live in a household where some people are using a latrine and some people aren't. Because what that means is that there's a working latrine, right? That means there's a latrine that you could use, that some people are using it. Those folks unambiguously have the option of using it. But some people in their households are walking clean past it and going out to the fields to defecate in the open. And it turns out that a fair chunk of people do that. If you go through and tabulate, is the latrine still in good working order, which is, of course, depends on the extent to which the household wants it to be in good working order, right? If someone takes it apart, if someone reuses the bricks for something else, then that's telling you something about how much they want it in the first place. But 48% of households with a working latrine had at least one household member who defecates in the open. So that's really putting the nail in the coffin of this access story, right? Because people who have it right there still aren't using it. And that's not something that you see when you go talk to people in other developing countries. So we're beginning to see that this is something that somebody would do even if they had access to a latrine. And there are some interesting patterns to it. So again, only looking at households that have a working latrine. This is age on the horizontal axis. So children up to I guess we stopped at 80-year-olds. This is do you defecate in the open is the vertical axis. So open defecation is up. See a lot of children defecate in the open until and then young women are particularly likely to use the latrine. But not all of them. And then you see this pattern where, amongst the adults that are older and have more social status and more freedom to sort of choose what they do, you see more open defecation again until you get to the oldest adults who basically can't go out to the fields anymore. And so this pattern about young women being the most likely to use is something people talk about a lot. Young women, especially daughters-in-law, are particularly likely to use a latrine if they're the most likely of anyone. But people are often sometimes surprised that as many as 15% of them defecate in the open anyway. And I think the right way to think about this is to remember that, like, a young woman who's a daughter-in-law in a Uttar Pradesh village, who's married into her family's household. This is patriarchality, so she's living with her husband's family's household. She's doing a lot of the work. She's a socially low-ranking person. She doesn't get to choose a lot of what she does in her life anyway. Her family is keeping her inside, not only during, defecation time, but basically always. So you'd be surprised how often we talk to somebody who said, I remember before I got married, and I was, a daughter of my own village, and I got to go defecate in the open, and now I basically don't get to go outside. And I can't wait until I'm the mother-in-law, and then I get to defecate in the open again. Because it'd be a time to, sort of be out and about. Not everybody says that. Many women would like to have a toilet and don't have one. Women, especially young women, typically aren't the decision makers in these households. And so all I want to do is emphasize that there are people of all types in that category. We hear various stories there. So what you can do is you can use these data using the properties. So the properties of the people who have latrines are different than people who don't have latrines, right? They're different than people who don't have latrines in ways we can see in terms of how rich they are, how educated they are, and they're different in ways we can't see about things correlated with how much they want to have and use a latrine, because either they made one or they accepted being a part of government one. But we can ignore that and say the optimistic case that the people who don't have latrines would be every bit as likely to use it as the people who do have latrines, and match it and create a projection of how many people would defecate in the open in these states if the government built a latrine for everybody, which, this government claims it's going to do, and prior governments have also claimed they're going to do. And what we would find is that if the people who don't have them would be no more likely to use them than the people who do, and that seems like wildly optimistic projection, then there'd still be most of the rural people defecating in the open. So again, we see that building latrines is not going to be enough to solve this problem. Okay, now I've gotten away from health for a little bit, but I want to return to a health question, which is to ask whether this difference between having access to a latrine, either because you have one or can afford one, and actually using one, either because you use one you have or you manage to go buy one or want to go buy one, turns out to matter for health. And I want to return to this question that we started with, which is, in health economics and social epidemiology these days, we're very used to the idea that wealthier is healthier, that, richer people, richer populations, on average, have better health outcomes. But we're seeing examples where that's not the case. So we compared India with sub-Saharan Africa earlier on some outcomes. Let's look within India now, comparing babies in India that are born to Hindu households and babies that are born to Muslim households. And this is using the government of India's NFHS data, the DHS data. And so what we see is that, this is widely known and recognized within India, that on average, Hindu households are richer than Muslim households. In the DHS, we can see that they're more likely to have these assets. The moms are more likely to be educated. In surveys that have consumption data, you can see that consumption is higher amongst Hindu households than Muslim households. But there's this puzzling fact, which is that mortality goes the other way. Child mortality is meaningfully higher amongst Hindu babies than Muslim babies. And this is basically in the first, I said child mortality, which is up to age 5, but basically all the action is happening in the first year of life, the infant mortality period. So infants in India, so Muslim infants in India, babies in India, are more likely to survive their first year of life than Hindu babies in India are, even though, on average, they're poorer. So when we see this, across the wealth distribution, so this is the infant mortality rate. So it's the deaths per 1,000 live births. So 100 is 10% and 40 is 4%. This is the poorest to the richest households in the DHS. And so now we're controlling for looking at people. I said earlier that on average Hindus are richer than Muslims. Even when you look at the same rates important, I guess that has to be true given what we saw before, here's the average amongst Hindu babies, and here's the average amongst Muslim babies. And we see this difference for rich and poor alike, that Hindu babies are more likely to die in the first year of life. We see, talking about height as an important indicator of well-being across all heights of their moms. We see the same thing there too. So there's a real puzzle there, which is, Sonia Malhotra and colleagues named this the Muslim mortality paradox, or the Muslim survival paradox. And you've got something interesting on your hands, where it's a named paradox. That you can look at all of the things that we typically think of in developing countries as explaining child health outcomes, and it can't account for or explain away this gap. You can put all of the decomposition variables that you want about properties of that household, and you still see this survival advantage for Muslims in the first year of life relative to Hindus. And again, we're just looking within India now. We're here to talk about toilets, and so, you'd be catching on to how my mystery novel is going if you suspected that sanitation might be part of the whodunit. But remember, part of the clue here is that having and using a toilet isn't the same thing as being able to afford one. And it turns out that Muslims in India are more likely to own a toilet than Hindus are. Muslims in India households in India are more likely to use one that they own than Hindu households are. And here's really the important thing. There's religious segregation on average in India. So Muslim people tend to live near other Muslim people on average, and Hindu people tend to live near other Hindu people on average. And so the average Muslim baby lives near a lot of Muslim households, and the average Hindu baby lives near a lot of Hindu households. And that means that the average Muslim baby has a lot more neighbors who use a toilet or latrine than the average Hindu baby does. The household level difference sort of adds up. And that turns out to be an important clue, because it actually isn't a Muslim survival advantage at all. It actually isn't a Muslim survival advantage at all. And we sort of knew that when we knew that none of the properties of the households could explain it. It turns out to be a Muslim neighbor survival advantage. Hindu babies who live next to a lot of Muslim neighbors do every bit as well on this survival metric as Muslim babies who live next to the same amount of Muslim neighbors. And Muslim neighbors who live next to a bunch of Hindus do every bit as poorly as Hindu babies who live next to a bunch of Hindus. It's not so much about your own household as it is about your neighbors. Because remember what I said earlier, open defecation is something that probably happens when you go walk away from your own household a little bit, right? But in a densely populated place like India, you're probably pretty close to somebody else's. And in fact, when you walk around these villages, you can see the feces on the ground, on the paths, and it's never very far from somebody else, right? And so that means that what economists call externalities, the effect of one person on somebody else, are a big part of what's going on here. And so, what's interesting about this is that we can learn about these sanitation externalities, because this is the rare case where a good thing is correlated with a bunch of other bad things. So, even if you're not as interested as I am in just basic demographic facts about India and infant mortality rates, which I can't get enough of, if you're just interested in the effect of sanitation, it's this special case to learn from, because people who have more Muslim neighbors are exposed to less neighbor open defecation, but aren't worse off in other ways. So this here is about your neighbors in your village or your block. And the horizontal axis here is the fraction of your neighbors who are Muslim. And the vertical axis here is a bunch of things that predict better health. So how rich you are, do you have piped water, do you have institutional delivery, is your mom literate, do you have electricity? These two graphs are basically the same, except on this one on the right, we've trimmed off the large chunk of people at 0 and 1, just to show you that's not what's really driving the result. And what we see, remember, in all of these cases, we've arranged it, so up is better, right? And what we've seen is that The big black line is latrine use. So people who live near more Muslim neighbors are exposed to a higher fraction of their neighbors using latrines rather than defecating in the open. When we see about all these other things that we know matter when they're different, is that they're not different, that they're either flat or maybe going down a little bit. And so really the only thing that's pointing in this direction is latrine use. And it turns out that it can account for it. That I said earlier that when Muslim or Hindu babies are exposed to the same fraction of their neighbors who are Muslim or Hindu, they have the same fraction, they have the same survival probabilities. Well, the same thing is true for sanitation here. So the horizontal axis here is the fraction of your neighbors who use a latrine rather than defecating in the open. The vertical axis is infant mortality. The orange line is Hindu babies, and the green line is Muslim babies. And both of the lines slope down, right? That's no surprise. That's just telling us that people who live near more neighbors who use a toilet or latrine are more likely to survive the first year of life. But the interesting thing is that the lines are basically on top of each other, and the dots of the average difference between Hindus and Muslims are right on the line. And what that tells us is that the difference in infant mortality can be statistically accounted for by the difference in exposure to neighbors' open defecation. When you match on neighbors' open defecation, you match on infant mortality too. You know, just like everything I'm talking about, there's a whole paper behind this that I encourage you to all look at. And you know, it really does turn out that it doesn't seem like other things can account for this. So, with my last 15 minutes or so, I want to turn to an important question of sort of, so what? What does all this mean for sanitation policy? And, you know, the ones who are paying attention will notice that I still haven't told you why so many people in India defecate in the open. I've ruled a lot of things out. And I've told you that people who have latrines still do it. I've told you that Muslims are on average less likely to do it. I've told you that it's not about all these other things. And I've told you something very important, which is that people don't use basic pit latrines, right? So maybe another question we could ask is, what's so bad about basic pit latrines? And that's a very important question, because sanitation policy right now is building pit latrines. The government of India has, you know, quite literally in 2014, when this new government was elected, announced a plan to build 1 latrine per second for 5 years. I don't know if they're going to sustain it for the whole 5 years, but in any event, I think that's not what they said. But 1 latrine per second for some time period, to eliminate open defecation entirely by 2019. So, in the same SWOT survey, we asked people, you know, what they think about latrines. And what they told us is that a latrine in or near the home is polluting. Now, that doesn't mean the same thing as dirty, like in the sense of like germy or has dirt on it. It means ritually polluting. And I want to pause on this for a second, because it means ritually polluting in the system of purity and pollution that is behind the caste system. So the caste system in India is a very detailed and very strong form of social hierarchy that ranks people into higher and lower ranking castes. And closely associated with the caste system, sort of the mechanism that propagates it, is an idea of purity and pollution. Of, you know, some people are pure and some people are defiled and defiling, and some people do dirty work and some people absorb other people's impurity. And the lowest ranking people in the caste system, you know, the people who used to be called untouchables, and these days we might be more likely to call Dalits, which comes from a word meaning, you know, people say oppressed, but literally like ground up like a spice. The lowest ranking people in the caste system, the Dalits, are the ones who do the dirtiest and most degrading work and are expected to. So, on latrine pits, hold that in your head about Dalits, and we're going to tie it all together in just a second. In the SWOT survey, we asked people, you know, how big of a thing do they have underground that their feces goes into. Now, a normal, like, latrine pit that the WHO or something recommends, or the government in the builds, would like be all the way over here, like 60 cubic feet, right? So these things over here aren't latrine pits at all. they're septic tanks, right? So they're great big septic tanks underground, and people are much more likely to use a toilet. I have to stop saying latrines, because once we get over here, we're not talking about pit latrines at all anymore, if it has one of these great big septic tanks. So remember our fact earlier that people don't want to use simple latrines. What do they want to use? A 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot or 1,000 cubic foot septic tank. And when we ask people, what they want, so the WHO has done all these tests about what's good enough, and that people use all the time in other developing countries, about 50, 60 cubic feet. It fills up after 5 years. Remember that. You have to empty it, but that's okay. That's what people use in other developing countries. That's what we've seen in evidence makes people healthier. So that's what, under the more or less, what the government of India builds. We can update that. They spend more money on it now. But what we see that people build for themselves is something much larger. And when we ask them, what would you be willing to use? They say this 1,000 cubic foot thing. Right? So dus, meaning 10 foot by 10 foot by 10 foot, which is basically an entire brick house of rooms underground. And people say to us, like, how could I afford to build a latrine? What do you mean, dig a hole? And then they'll say, if I could do that, I would build a new house. So the minimal usable thing that people have in mind in India isn't a pit latrine at all. It's a big 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot septic tank. Not literally a septic tank in terms of having all like the health-producing things that like a septic tank would have here, but a room of bricks underground to accumulate feces. And when we ask them why, they say, well, no one's going to live forever, was one answer we sometimes got. And so what does that mean, right? Like, what that means is I want it to never fill up. I want the feces to subjectively go away. I want to never have to deal with it. And that's what's different. All around the world, in other developing countries, people use pit latrines, and then they fill up. And then somebody empties them basically by hand with a bucket and shovel. That's not fun. That's a bad job. It's people who are down on their luck usually who are doing that job. But in these other developing countries, it's not like in India. Because in these other developing countries, the people who have that job of a latrine pit emptier, they're not people whose parents weren't allowed to go into temples, right? They're not people whose parents had to clean up after weddings and eat the scraps, right? They're not people whose parents and grandparents would have been manual scavengers who go into high caste houses and scoop up the feces in a plate and put it on their heads and take it away, right? They weren't people who were Dalits in particular, because that's something that really only exists with the caste system. So what's special and different about sanitation in rural India is the continuing legacy of untouchability and purity and pollution, and that people still associate latrines and latrine pits with it. People reason like this. If I defecate in this small latrine pit, and remember, small here means internationally normal, but the thing that the Indian government builds, it's going to fill up. Now, it's actually going to fill up in about 5 years, probably, for a normal-sized family, but people falsely think it's going to fill up in about, a couple months or something. And so they think, because they've never seen anyone actually fill theirs up, because everyone's thinking the same way in equilibrium. Right? If I use this thing, it's going to fill up. And that's going to be terrible for a few big reasons. One is that this is like the worst ritually polluting stuff. And it's going to be all accumulating by my house. And that's going to be making, the area by my home impure. But worse, I'm never going to be able to empty it. Because a person who is, a moderately high caste-ranking Hindu would never be willing to empty his own latrine pit, right? That would be just subjectively unacceptable, right? And he worries that if he tries to hire a Dalit to empty it, well, social progress is happening far too slowly in India, but it is happening. And maybe the person will refuse, and that would be very unpleasant. Or maybe they'll charge a lot of money, and that would also be very unpleasant. The amount of money that people think people will charge to empty a latrine pit, is basically enough money to build 2 latrines in Bangladesh. All right? So when people think about latrine pits in India, they think, I can't ever let this thing get filled up. Maybe if I have a very old person who's disabled, who needs to use it in an emergency, that person can use it. Maybe if I have a young daughter-in-law who can use it, then better for her to use it than to go out in the open and be in public. But my goodness, if we let this thing get filled up, we're going to have a terrible problem on our hands. So as a result, it's not about access, right? It's about how people think about latrines and the consequences of them that matter for them. But that means that providing access isn't going to solve the problem. So, like I said earlier, the government of India didn't solve this problem. Didn't start this problem. And in other countries, governments didn't either. But it is important to ask what the government can really do about this. So here's a picture from December in Orissa. And I'm looking, you can't be exactly sure what's going on. My team speaks Hindi. I'm not a native, I'm not any kind of Oriya speaker. But here's my understanding of the story. This latrine was built by a very special randomized controlled trial to figure out the effects of open defecation on health. It's a nice, fancy latrine. It has this sink of water in it. Blah blah blah. So what happened? Well, A, nobody used it. B, they're piling their sticks in it to keep them dry. And C, somebody came along and painted it with the logo of the Swachh Bharat Mission, which is the current program of the government of India, so that they could collect the money for having built a latrine under the Swachh Bharat Mission, right? So it's really worth asking in a context where a lot of latrines have been built by government programs already that people aren't using. Is building a lot more latrines going to help? And it probably isn't. But that's more or less what's going on. So the government of India has announced a goal to completely eliminate open defecation by 2019. So the dark line is the long-run trend. This dashed line is the fastest that any country has ever decreased open defecation over a 5-year period, which was Ethiopia. And the sanitation experts I know who work in Ethiopia tell me that's false. And it's like this, it has sort of the population of 2 Indian districts. This is what would have had to have already happened in India in 2014 for us to get on that trend. We're more than halfway through this 5-year schedule, and there's no reason to think anything like that is happening. Of course, we don't actually know, because the government really isn't measuring open defecation in a credible way. It's tracking construction spending. It's tracking, the way of measuring what's going on is the higher-ranking people ask the lower-ranking people, hey, did you build your latrines? And they go back, oh yeah, by typing it into a computer. There are surveys that happen, but it's not the sort of survey that tries to ask the careful question like I asked earlier. It's basically, you use your latrine, right? Oh yeah. So we really don't know what's going on, except for the fact that the program is the same program we've seen before, which is basically building latrines. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a great idea to try to do something about open defecation if you can, right? But what that would mean is probably a different type of program that takes very seriously the ideas people tell us for why they defecate in the open, right? It takes very seriously what people think about latrine pits. So maybe instead of spending a lot of money, like $200, to build these very fancy buildings, maybe when you can, build a bigger pit if that's what people want, right? Or maybe put a lot of effort into talking with people about how long it takes them to fill up. Maybe they won't believe you. I don't know, right? Maybe they won't. Maybe you can't persuade people about this sort of purity and pollution thing. Maybe you have to wait a long time. Well, we could be trying, right? We could imagine a scenario in which lots of people out there are taking seriously these ideas of purity and pollution that people tell us, and trying things out and telling one another about it and doing careful things that we can learn from our trial and error and actually draw conclusions about whether or not it worked, and building this evidence to change something and accelerate something that's been about 1 percentage point a year for a long time. There are things we could be doing, even if this isn't it. I won't dwell on this, but again, that's not what's happening. We've done a randomized phone survey to ask people what they've heard about this government program. And it's a pretty famous government program because the Prime Minister has made it his personal project, talked about it in a big speech. The new money in India, I don't know if you heard about the demonetization, the new money in India actually has the logo of the Swachh Bharat mission on it, but it doesn't say anything about toilets or latrines. And so, when we ask people, hey, have you heard of the Swachh Bharat mission? And we don't ask any follow-up questions and just let them say yes or no, most people say yes, at least in urban places. But then when we say, okay, what is it? And we just let them volunteer whatever they want, say as many things as they want, and we have the surveyors tick down if they say anything about toilets or anything about latrines. Like a teeny tiny fraction of people say anything about toilets or anything about latrines. The sort of answer you get is, the Prime Minister wants me to clean my house. And if you look in rural Uttar Pradesh, one thing I want to tie out is the people who are able to say this about latrine use. These are one-digit percentage points, right? The dark lines are men, and the light lines are women. And that's not a typo. Like 0 women in rural Uttar Pradesh who didn't have at least above secondary school were able to volunteer for us that the Swachh Bharat mission had anything to do with toilets or latrines. Now, you might say, who cares? You might say, they don't need to know the name of the program. They just need to know about using toilets or latrines. And I completely grant that. And I would far rather be talking about the data that I wish the government were collecting that's careful and credible about people actually using latrines or defecating in the open. I'd far rather be talking about what we can learn from these fantastic hypothetical studies, trying things out about purity and pollution and pit fillings out to learn from it. And some people are starting to do that now, and I think that's really promising. But I think what we're left is that this is a really big challenge, because 3 things turn out to happen in the same place that did not have to happen in the same place, that was not logically necessary. One is enduring open defecation. There's a lot of open defecation in India, even though it's going down everywhere else. So every year, when UNICEF and the WHO make their new statistics, a higher and higher fraction of the world's remaining open defecation is in India, right? Because it's going away everywhere else and not in India. The other thing that didn't have to be true, but is that India is a country in high population density. So it's not just that there's a lot of open defecation, it matters a lot. If you look at lower population density places, like in sub-Saharan Africa, the gradient between open defecation externalities and child outcomes isn't as steep. But India is a place where it is. And finally, what we've seen is that there's a low demand for, simple is what I have written there. I should have written normal, right? Internationally normal pit latrines. People don't want to use them in India because of the purity and pollution associated with the caste system. And the fact that all these 3 things happen in the same time in India, and really in basically rural India, didn't have to happen. It is, and it's a grand human development challenge. And I hope that some of you will, in your work, think about this as something that you can help contribute to finding a resolution for this intersection. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spears, for this thought-provoking talk that I'm confident resonated with many people in this room. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Karen Greppen. It is difficult to do justice to all of Dr. Karen's incredible achievements, but I'll try to name just a few. Dr. Greppen is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University and has a PhD in health policy in economics from Harvard University, and a Master of Science in Health Policy and Management from the Harvard School of Public Health. Prior to joining Laurier. She was an assistant professor at the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service at New York University. She is also a visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington. Finally, and arguably most important, is that Dr. Greppin found some great ramen noodles in Ottawa. But unfortunately for her, it's not in her home city. I Googled for you last night, and I found 3 locations in Toronto if you're interested. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Karen Greppin.
I guess I should be careful about what I tweet. I do have some slides. Okay, how do I get them? I'm not a PC user, so I always. Can you hear me okay? Can you see me? After that last talk, I'm a little bit more self-conscious about my height, but I am here if you can't see me. On average, thank you. Okay. So it is a great honor to be here today. So when Emmanuel emailed me a couple weeks ago and said, would you like to come and give some comments at the Labelle Lecture, I was so honored. And then I realized he'd asked me to talk about defecation in India, and I thought, oh, why did he think of me? But I am still honored, so this is a great pleasure. I want to kind of pick up a little bit on what Dean had talked about. I had the opportunity to read the book, so my comments today are mostly going to be framed around the book itself and realizing, of course, that this is a huge body of literature, much of which is not mentioned. I wanted to emphasize some of the things I thought were really great about what's in the book, and maybe some of the things that I was puzzled about, and I remain puzzled about, and we had a little conversation about that this afternoon, so I know he's got some answers to some of my questions. So as Dean has said, defecation is open defecation is a huge, huge issue. It is a great, big, giant, shitty mess if you want to think about it. So every global health talk usually starts with some sort of statistic like this, saying how big this problem is, how important it is. And I want to tell you, these are huge numbers. These are really important numbers. 2.5 billion people live in homes that don't have that access, or what do we want to call that, to improve sanitation facilities. And 1/3 of them are in India. 1 billion people in the world, if you can imagine that, 1 billion people, that's not a typo. Literally get up in the morning, walk out their door, find a nice comfy spot, and relieve themselves. About 2 out of 3 of the people who do that also live in India. And this is a somewhat harder figure to put a number on, but about 1.5 million children, approximately, let's say, die every year from diarrhea. The good news on child mortality is that those numbers are coming down every year. And the bad news for diarrhea is that diarrhea is becoming a bigger share of that. So, about 5 or 6 million kids die every year, and so this is a very important number. The other observation that Dean has picked up on this book, and again, this is not something that he came up with himself. I mentioned earlier that India had this huge problem with open defecation and around diarrhea. It also has a huge problem associated with stunting, right? So we know this has been seen in lots of different data sets. It turns out measuring child height in household surveys is actually something that we're pretty good at and we've been doing for a very long time. So we have good data on it. Of course, we don't really know exactly what all the causal factors are going into that, right? So it is a proxy for a lot of things that could be happening to you early in your life. But we know it matters a lot, right? We know that shorter children are less intelligent and they're less productive later in life. They will earn less and they will be less productive members of society. So it's something that we should care about, not just for the health reasons, but for societal reasons as well. And I think there's pretty good consensus that this is not a genetic story, right? If you take a poor Indian child and raise them in Sweden, they will grow up to be taller, right? So this matters. And so that's where this book comes in, right? So there are these two existing observations, and what Dean's group did, and I'll call them Rice and collectively, they've really made some really substantial improvements in the way in which we collect data and measure and think about this issue, right? So up until now, if you ask anyone, the problem is access, right? So in global health, we say it's a lack of access when we don't actually understand how the demand and supply curve are going together. We just say it's an access problem. And so that's essentially what people would say here. So they had suspicions that a lot of the data that's currently collected on measures of latrine and defecation were inadequate. And so they went out and launched, I think, what is probably the best named survey ever, the SWOT survey, to get at a better picture in terms of thinking about how people are actually using the latrines that they have or don't have. And that has really shed some really interesting perspectives on the fact that people have these things and they're just not using them. And that's really fascinating. And then additionally, and this is something that is particularly, I think, rare in the context of economics these days, is this is really a true mixed method type of research, right? There was qualitative work being done alongside quantitative work. And in the era where so much of what we think of as sort of cutting-edge economics these days is coming from randomized control trials or other types of things, this is just really a breath of fresh air, no pun intended, about thinking about this really important question about diarrhea. So that stuff up until now I loved. I think it was really a fascinating part of the story. And then what the book tried to do is try to convince us that those two independent observations that I talked about before, high rates of open defecation in India and high rates of stunting in India, are actually causally associated with one another, right? And they do this in a couple of ways, right? So the first is by basically ruling out any other story, right? It's not about money. We know that Indians, on average, are much wealthier than households in sub-Saharan Africa, where I do most of my work, and yet they have worse outcomes. And this is true also if you compare it with its neighboring country, Bangladesh, where there's much, much lower rates of open defecation. And then even within India, areas, there's substantial variation in open defecation rates across the country, and it seems to line up with, not a story around income, where Muslims are actually worse off, but they have lower rates of defecation. It's not just about access. Dean has talked a lot about that. 40% of households who have them are not using them, and that's an important thing. And it's not just about governance, right? So I can attest to this, having done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa. Governance may be bad in India, but I can find lots of great examples in Africa where it's much, much worse, and where defecation rates are actually lower. And so this is where their main hypothesis of the book comes in. The reason why India has such high rates of open defecation is due to the persistence of the traditional caste system, right? And there's kind of two parts to this. If you are a higher caste Brahmin, you care a lot about the idea of ritual purity. And so this idea that you have poop near where you might cook or sleep or eat is not really a great thing, right? And so that means just off the bat, you would be much less likely to have or want to have a latrine somewhere near your house. And then secondly, the other sort of interesting phenomenon about the caste system in India is that there was actually, once upon a time, a role for people of the lower caste to be responsible for, or that is their job, to go around and collect other people's feces. And so although this practice is on the decline, and although the caste system is losing its powers, what it's actually leading to is this idea that there are fewer people around who are willing to do this pretty awful job. And so as a result, because you're not going to be able to empty your latrine down the road, it means that you're much less likely to want to use it to begin with. And I thought this was just a really interesting finding. Clearly something we wouldn't find from looking at our household survey data, and really spoke to the value of some of this qualitative research they were doing. And they have some empirical evidence to back up this hypothesis, right? So within India, areas that are more likely to have stronger enforcement of this untouchability system have higher rates of latrine use. And so up until then, I think I feel very good about that belief. I think it's a really interesting hypothesis that might help explain some of this open defecation. They then go on to also say, not only does that cause higher rates of open defecation, but this open defecation is what accounts for that lower height of Indian children. And so we talk about, he talks about the Muslim advantage, and again, this is known by many people. Muslims, on average, despite the fact that they are lower income within India, live longer or have lower rates of mortality as children. And they also most likely, he ties this in with this idea, they're also more likely to have latrines and use them. And then I think this really interesting analysis that they do, that it talks about, it's not just about you being Muslim, but it's also really important that your neighbors are Muslim. Because Muslims are more likely to own and use latrines, having more Muslim neighbors is important, and that could actually wipe out the sort of disadvantage of being a Hindu child. If you're a Hindu child in a Muslim neighborhood where sort of people using toilets near you, that can actually mean that you have better health outcomes. And so that's a really compelling story. What I found a little puzzling is that there are other people who have come up with other stories to also look at some of these associations with lower height of Indian children. And in fact, this is from a paper that's been floating around for a couple of years, but actually just came out last week in publication. It's a paper by Seema Jayachandran and Rohini Pandey, in which they also take up this question about why are Indian children so short. And they start out with that same observation that compared to sub-Saharan Africa, where they have similar data from the demographic and health surveys, Indian children are much shorter, despite the fact that at any given wealth level, they're much shorter than their African counterparts. However, their sort of piece of evidence to try to help explain the solution is a somewhat different one. So if you look at children within households, whether you're firstborn, secondborn, or thirdborn, what they find is somewhat interesting is that Indian children, firstborn Indian children, if anything, actually are doing better than their African counterparts. However, by second-order births and by third-order births, you start to see this disadvantage accumulate. And so their story is it has more to do with sort of resource allocation within families. They also, for example, find that these children are less likely to get prenatal investments and postnatal investments by their parents. And so the story here is not as much about open defecation, but just about resources and how they get allocated within the family. And they also argue that this explanation is enough to sort of explain the gap between Africa and India. And so it's a puzzle. So this is somebody else's hypothesis. It doesn't involve open defecation, and curious to see what your thoughts are. The other puzzle I had, so again, when I was asked to talk about open defecation in India, I Googled open defecation in India. And if you go to the Wikipedia website, this is where they list as the next most common countries in the world where open defecation. And up until now, the story is why India is so much worse is predominantly due to this Hindu system that exists. Oh, I should have said before, too, by the way, the resource allocation story is predominantly within Hindu families in India and due to preferences for children.
I think that, the way you phrased your titles, that's offensive to Indonesian, Pakistani, Nigerian, and even if I write something like that for Canada, that will be.
Yes.
And particularly if the native Canadian would put something like that, most of the Anglo-Saxons and Italians will be raising their hands up. So I think you should apologize for that.
Okay, I apologize for that. I was also asked to be a little bit controversial, and in global health, I think it's hard not to talk about diarrhea.
Global health is the only one thing which is global, and that is the airlines. Nothing else is global. Okay. Otherwise, it's just a word.
I think infectious diseases might take offense at that. But I'm just listing other countries where the practice of open defecation is quite common.
No, I just meant the way you phrased it.
I agree, and it was intentional to be a little controversial. But there are a lot of other countries in the world where open defecation is common. This is my point. And not all of them are Hindu countries. In fact, they're not Hindu countries. So this story also would be more compelling if it also helped us shine a little bit of light in terms of thinking about how we can think about it in other international contexts. And I apologize for the word shitty. So that's, just in terms of things I thought were maybe a little more open in terms of the talk. And then the other thing that I wondered about with the book is, and I think this is a challenge, in particular given how the authors begin the book, is that they very plainly say that we are interested in this topic because we don't know how to solve it. And I think a book that doesn't sort of try to shed some light in terms of thinking about how we can actually try to address some of these issues is a challenge. And so they come up with some really great recommendations, which I agree with strongly, like you should consider culture, you should think about how to make people use these toilets a bit more. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that, after sort of 10 or 15 years of massive amounts of latrine construction, there was a movement towards thinking, let's not just think about the hardware, we need to think more about the software, right? Thinking, how do you get people to actually use these toilets? And so there were a lot of efforts that were launched around the world, some of them including in places like India, in which there were sort of these more integrated programs that were launched that were attempting to try to get at some of the demand-side factors for using toilets. How do you encourage people, villages, communities to want to use the toilets that are made available to them? And so these are sort of increasing in terms of the sort of level of those types of things, partially as a result of the kind of push towards the big latrine projects without any evidence that any of them are working. A lot of these projects have actually now been evaluated using randomized control trials, usually cluster randomized control trials in different communities. And I think, my read on it is that it's a little bit unsatisfying in that there's not a lot of evidence, even when you do get people, one, that we can get people to use toilets using these approaches, but two, that even if you do get people to shift a little bit in the latrine use, you don't see a lot of health impacts. So for example, this is one of the papers, was actually one of the toilets, I believe, that you showed in your slide. This randomized control trial did a lot of work building, but also trying to increase demand for latrines in a part of India. Latrine coverage went from 9% to 63%, pretty substantial, but they couldn't find any measurable improvement in diarrhea or child malnutrition. A similar sort of evaluation, but this time of a kind of more demand-driven program that didn't involve a lot of construction of latrines in Indonesia. Also saw increased ownership of latrines, reduction in roundworms, so some evidence, and sort of a increased negative perception of open defecation, but again, no other health impacts. And then finally, a paper came out earlier this year that I was actually a part of, in which we did a large randomized evaluation of a community-based hygiene club, which is sort of a women, community-centered program that was trying to incentivize people to understand the externalities associated with open defecation and to make efforts to try to reduce it. We found that the program had really good adherence, that people did participate with it, that they did improve their knowledge, that they did do the things that we thought the program would do. We couldn't measure any impact on diarrhea. So part of my question is, do we know for sure that reducing open defecation will also improve health outcomes? And might that be sort of the red herring, right? We like to see something that we can build. We like to see something that we can, put money into. But maybe we should be worried more about, maybe it's hand washing, or maybe we have to get all these communities to 100% before any of this works. I don't know. And so I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that as well. So final thoughts. So this is a really, really important health issue. And it's not one that a lot of times people like to talk about, right? So, I think it's wonderful to finally see some, that the proverbial light being shone on the issue of diarrhea and open defecation in India. It's something that we need to get more people excited about talking about. I also think there's a lot of really interesting parallels between the work, Dean's work here on open defecation, and maybe some of the other kind of silver bullets that we think about in global health. For example, bed nets. People might own them, people might hang them. Doesn't mean they're really using them the way that they're supposed to be. So what can we learn from this work that might apply in other contexts as well? And then finally, I just thought the book was fantastic. It's a wonderfully well-researched and well-written book. It introduces a whole lively set of characters, the people who are cooking in their government-built latrines, because it's such a convenient place to cook your dinner. It's just a real pleasure to read, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who's looking for a great book to read this semester while going to class. And that's it.
We're going to open the floor up now for Q&A. And Karen, if you want to stay up here too. We have 10 minutes, so we're running a bit behind. So we can start from the front. I have a question right up there, Sarah. Go ahead. Can you just say who the question is for?
So I guess it's primarily for Dean, but I mean, I'm not just saying it. I was curious, you talked a little bit about how open defecation is measured or not measured in some cases. And I was wondering if you think that the measurement tools maybe limit how creative we are about getting people to measure their open defecation. The question comes from the fact that, in my experience, very briefly in Ghana, they were very frustrated by the fact that there was a huge uptake of people using machines, but they weren't getting credit globally for reducing their open defecation rate because they were public latrines rather than individual household latrines. So I'm wondering if there's something there about the way in which we measure and incentivize nation that limits the way we actually address the issue.
So should I collect a few and then respond?
Yeah, that'd be great, actually.
Excuse me. I think you've got excellent skill of collecting all the material, putting them together, and putting a lot of graphs and statistical, which is mostly numbers and mathematics. I'm not one of those evidence-based, follower, whether medicine or social sciences, which is a big flag for McMaster. So, having presented this, talk, and I'm sure you have presented this in many other places across North America, and maybe you might be going across to Europe if you haven't had the opportunities as well, and studying the book probably quite well. So, what is the ultimate objective, and how is that going to help that social practice, which is mostly religious, and it has I see a very long historical background, and I would suggest that the real thing begins, before Alexander, the terrorist, went across, 3 continents to trouble the rest of the planet. That it all begins there, where the invasion begins. It's just the Romans, they went around, troubled Gauls and the Goths, and then the Greeks and all that, came around, and the Romans went to Britain to civilize the Brits, and the British thought we can go around and civilize the rest of the planet. So, and the Freud continued on the anal fixations, and all those Freud's philosophies have failed on the castration and all those stages, when now they are single parents. So this is a very interesting topic that you brought up, and it discussed me and changed me a lot because I have stopped actually traveling from New Delhi to Punjab, by early trains from between 4 o'clock and 9 a.m.
We just need to take another question, so if you don't...
Okay. No, this is not just, like leaving the subject here because in 10 minutes. This is not a 10-minute thing. He has not opened a can of worms, but he has opened a can of poop.
Perfect. And you can
So
actually take other
it
questions.
is, you have to, look into the historical background, and there is misinterpretation and misunderstood things about, Hinduism, and about the Brahmins and the purity. And I don't know what group of people you have been meeting, because when people from Europe and North America goes to India or goes to Africa, okay, the things completely change, okay, right from the moment the airport door is open to them, okay, and the attitude and the concern by the people living in India is different from somebody who have lived across Europe, Australia, and North America like me for the last 45 years. I have a very different perspective about Canada, about every place, and about
I'm going to invite you to continue to
so
talk.
that's why there are a lot of misinterpretation, and along with those big figures which been distributed and transmitted there are certain flaws and misunderstandings, and I think that has to be looked into and explained better.
Thank you, sir. Question here.
I'd like to ask Dr. Spears. I'm confused. Is there an association between education, economic status, and democratic structures between social environment? And why, if there is, why is these things change and social environment doesn't change in India?
Maybe you should answer the first two questions if you
Could you ask your question again, actually? I don't think I understood.
I'm sorry. Native English is not my native. I want to know, is there a connection or association between economic status, education level, and between and social environment? Is there a connection between this factors? If there is, why this social, this economic status changed and education level changed, but social environment doesn't change in India? Like open defecation still open, still occurs in India.
Yeah. All right. So how long do we have?
I would say 2 minutes to address the question.
All right. Well,
you'll have a chance to talk to more.
Yes, great. So we can all chat some more. Thanks for all of those thoughts. I want to say, and this is naturally there's a tension between sort of telling a complete but brief story and covering everything that you can cover in the 20 pages, the 20 research papers behind it. If I had more time, I think it would be interesting to talk about what you're talking about how hard it is to identify effects of birth order on child height from demographic and health survey data, because it only measures the height of the youngest children, which means that it's difficult to separate birth order from the size of families. I think what I would emphasize about the RCT literature that exists is that, it's exactly right that there have been some studies that, spent a lot of money on building latrines and didn't see any effect on health outcomes. I think, typically, and the authors will say to us, because people weren't using them. What Paul Gertler and the team of co-authors did was take a bunch of these RCTs together and do an instrumental variables estimate of the applied effect of open defecation on child height, pooling all of these using the randomization as an instrument. And what Gertler and his team found was an effect of local open defecation on child height that was exactly the quantity necessary to account for the India-Africa height gap. If you do a similar exercise with the Klassen experiment, you get a great big wide confidence interval because there's a very weak first stage. I mean, they didn't actually change anything very much about open defecation. So, what that means is you don't learn very much, right? If you try to learn about the effect of open defecation by changing it, but you don't actually change it very much, and you don't actually learn very much, and what that means is you have a really big confidence interval, and that's in fact what we see. And the confidence interval includes no effect, but it also includes effects at least as big as I've ever said, and even negative effects, right? So I think if you look at the RCT literature not as sort of binary yes or no, but as like an IB estimate of the effect, it's actually really quite consistent. Another thing that I think is really interesting is you mentioned diarrhea at the end. And it's possible that diarrhea isn't actually the mechanism here, but it's instead about absorbing your food and putting it to good use. And that long-term exposure to pathogens prevents you from being able to do that. There are a lot of questions about measurement, I want to say that it's just not that hard to do one of these surveys if folks want to know how much open defecation there is. When I was sat down, I was handed this note that says, Toilet Ek Prem Katha, which is the new movie by Akshay Kumar, recommended to go see it. So that's Hindi for Toilet, a Love Story. It's a story about like a young couple and the wife leaves him over not having a toilet. Very much the sort of thing I was talking about there. So I am a very lucky person as economics professors go, and I get to live most of the time in India. Earlier this summer, Diane and I had the opportunity to give Akshay Sir, as his co-star called him, a copy of our book in a great big party at a mall. And you can find a picture of it on the internet. I think you've lived long enough. Yeah, I will be the first to admit that I don't know everything about the long history of India and the many things that have happened back and forth over time. Really, all of my experience and study has been sort of about contemporary rural North India, which is a small fraction of the whole historical time period. And on the last thing about is becoming richer or educated a path to improving social inclusion versus social exclusion? Can we undermine these hierarchies and change social attitudes through basically economic development and education? And I think history gives us an answer of a great big maybe, kinda, partially, right? I was born in the United States, which is a country with a long history and enduring legacy of racism, and a lot of people there are very rich and very highly educated, and racism there continues. And so I think that we can't count on economic progress and education being enough to guarantee progress towards social equality, unfortunately, which means that for a lot of these things, the history is probably going to be longer still. Thanks.
Questions? We'll take them now. I know there was one right there. Go ahead.
Well, I was curious to see if you went to Kerala at all, and did you study what's happening in Kerala? Because India is a vast country.
Sure.
The second comment I'll say is that have you worked with sociologists, anthropologists to try to understand the cultural aspects, which are really the dominating factors here? As
yes. Yeah, exactly. No. I'm really lucky to get to collaborate interdisciplinarily on all this. In fact, we've collaborated with quite a few sociologists and anthropologists. Diane herself is a demographer, but sits in the sociology department. And this is all about culture, definitely. Or culture is an important part of what's going on here. And intra-India heterogeneity, like I said, is telling. Kerala is special in a lot of ways. And I'll just have to leave it at Kerala is special in a lot of ways for now.
I think initially what he did is taking the story of Jesus and as a shepherd. He never either walked in front or behind the sheep. He walked along with the sheep. And that's what is needed, and that's what is lacking now all over the planet, actually. All those conflicts going on. So we need, all human beings to, not just, walk up the ladder and get up there and say, oh, I'm looking down. Oh, hey, come on. No, that doesn't work. So everybody has to take this, one step at a time and take it together. Not like the Romans or the Britishers or the, Alexander the terrorist. I don't know why he's called brave. Okay? And now you see, so as I say, they've been saying that every donkey gets a turn. So it's now the American donkey's turn. So that will also go past. That donkey will move on. And so the new donkey will come and start eating. So what is needed is a segment. Everybody needs to move together up and up. And not to have a chase like the gazelle being terrorized and chased by a tiger. And the little baby gazelle is left behind to be just swallowed. And that should not happen. And that's what it is.
So if there's any other questions, we'll invite you to ask them at the reception. You'll spend this time with our wonderful speakers today. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And special thanks goes out to CHEPA, HEI, they just changed their name, so I have to get used to it. PASS for continuing support of the Labelle Lecture Series. We also like to thank the generous donations for the past 25 years. We encourage anyone interested in donating to the Labelle Lecture Series to inform McMaster if they're donating it to the series. We'd also like to thank Noel Fraser for his support the past decade, who is soon retiring, to the great despair of many of us here at CHEPA. I leave you now with one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Seuss. Think left and think right, and think low and think high. Oh, the things you can think of if you only try. Thank you all for attending, and we kindly invite you now to the reception following.